Tonight on The Late Debate, who will pay for the passengers staying away? London's transport boss says some change is here to stay.
I don't think people will find it societally acceptable to be crammed into tubes and buses the way they once were.
And Unlocking London, we'll be discussing what the Prime Minister's roadmap means for the capital. Good evening. Transport for London is engaged in the biggest financial negotiation in its history. If it's unsuccessful, it'll run out of money in a matter of weeks. Thanks to the pandemic, the Tube is carrying fewer than a fifth of its normal passengers. Bus trips are down by 2/3. TfL wants a lasting deal with the government to get London moving again, and talks between the two sides are said to be intense and tough. Rush hour shouldn't look like this. On the Piccadilly line this week, some carriages were almost empty. Once they would have been packed with morning commuters and Heathrow travellers. But for those who have to travel during lockdown, life underground has changed.
There's always a place to sit, even in peak hour.
You haven't got the armpits in your faces and whatever else.
You can see like the TfL staff cleaning the handrails and things like that, and it's much neater.
It feels okay, it feels kind of safe, everyone's wearing masks.
It's all very different from a year ago, when Tube passengers thought nothing of doing the conga, when the daily commute inevitably meant a rush hour crush, when social distancing didn't exist. And COVID may have a lasting impact on what Londoners will tolerate in future.
One thing I do think is true is that I don't think people will find it societally acceptable to be crammed into tubes and buses the way they once were.
That's just one of the challenges facing TfL as it tries to overcome a catastrophic loss of income caused by lockdown and working from home.
We've got to start looking long term. COVID is here to stay for some time. We've got to look at putting the money in so that transport in London can keep moving. So as people return to work, they're able to get around the city safely. And let's not forget, London is the engine for this country. We need people back to work safely so we can keep our economy going.
The government has given TfL £3.4 billion in bailouts since the start of the pandemic. It's asking ministers for a further £3 billion to keep it afloat for another 12 months, plus a further £1.6 billion every year until 2030. But the negotiations are complicated by the prickly relationship between Tory ministers and a Labour mayor.
He upsets them all. I think he takes great pleasure from it, but he has to understand that the consequence of that is that ministers in all of the departments of state sitting around the cabinet table are asking themselves, why do we have to make this guy look good? All he does is slag us off at every opportunity.
Hardly surprising then that Mr Byford describes the process as intense and tough and the most crucial in TfL's history.
My job is to negotiate a path between what the mayor wants, what the government wants, and ultimately to London's benefit. So my job's apolitical. I'm not interested in the politics.
The end of the pandemic might be in sight, but TfL bosses think 1/5 of the income from passengers will still be missing 2 years from now. To discuss that, I'm joined in the studio tonight by the Labour MP for Westminster North, Karen Buck, and for the Conservatives by the Orpington MP, Gareth Bacon. Joining us remotely for social distancing reasons is the Liberal Democrat peer, Baroness Sarah Ludford. Welcome, all of you. Karen and Gareth, first of all, to you two. Londoners might feel they're caught in the crossfire of this rather immature spat between Downing Street and City Hall. Is it really helpful at the moment?
Well, I think the critical thing is that the government needs to give the same sort of long-term deal to underpin Transport for London's confidence as it's given the mainline railways outside outside London, where there was a bailout, absolutely rightly, because the passenger traffic disappeared on the trains as it did on London Transport. But they got an 18-month deal, and they didn't get any of the sort of conditions and strings attached that were applied to TfL. It really is no good trying to kind of have all of those background negotiations about conditions. It has to be a security of a deal that will last and allow TfL to plan and to make the necessary changes.
Fair point, Gareth. Treat TfL just like they've treated the national rail companies, but it does seem to be that Downing Street and City Hall just don't like each other.
Well, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, I think the comments from Steve Norris earlier on is fairly close to how he is perceived in Whitehall. Unfortunately, the Mayor does try and play divide and rule a bit too much than is good for London, I would suggest.
But isn't the government being petty by not giving Transport for London a deal?
Well, it has given Transport for London 2 deals, and in fact,
but it needs another
more
one
than
pretty
that.
Quickly.
Well, yes, and it's going to get one. Look, I mean, I don't think there's any question that the government are going to step in and fund Transport for London. The point that Caroline Pidgeon made in your film earlier on is completely right. I mean, London is the dynamo of the UK economy. We can't have London fail, and we will have London fail if there's no transport in London. So, there's no question that there will be an agreement and Transport for London will carry on functioning. The question, I think, is how the relationship goes going beyond that. And I think part of the problem has been the actions the Mayor took pre-pandemic, which haven't helped Transport for London's finances. And I think that has had a knock-on effect.
You can't blame the Mayor entirely for Transport for London's finances. The pandemic is the problem.
Indeed. I mean, the pandemic is what has put TfL in this position, but actually TfL was not as robust as it might have been had the Mayor taken different decisions prior to the pandemic.
You mean the fares freeze, obviously?
Partly the fares freeze, but there are other
Sarah,
decisions
can I ask
as well.
you, who do you blame here? I mean, just let me point out that Steve Norris reckons the person to blame for all this is whoever let the bat out in Wuhan.
Well, I would say playing on both their houses a bit. I mean, it is a great pity that TfL has become the subject of what are obviously party political games. And I mean, Steve Norris said that cabinet ministers don't want to make a Labour mayor look good. Well, that's not the point. It's Londoners who need to have better lives, and it's Londoners who are going to be punished if TfL doesn't get proper funding. I mean, obviously its fare income has fallen off a cliff because of COVID, and it's obliged to rely to a far greater extent on fare income than other comparable cities like Paris, about to twice the extent, I think. The cost overruns and delays in Crossrail are the responsibility of Tory governments as well as a Labour mayor. And, Karen made the point about the train operating companies are being treated more generously compared to TfL, which carries as many passengers as all of them put together. The government has done a review, apparently, of the finances of TfL, but it's keeping it to itself. Why is
that, Gareth?
Publishing that review?
Well, I don't think the government trusts what TfL are giving them, so they've conducted a review. I think that will inform part of the negotiations when they take place. They haven't taken place yet. But on the point about Crossrail, I mean, the Mayor is very keen to try and rope the government in and blame them for the failure of Crossrail, the delay of Crossrail. But the fact of the matter is that Crossrail Limited is a wholly owned subsidiary of Transport for London, which is chaired by the Mayor. TfL is the delivery arm of Crossrail. The Mayor is a joint sponsor, they're the enabling body, but TfL is the body that is due to deliver it. And when the previous Mayor left office, it was on time and on budget, and then suddenly it wasn't. It's now 3 years overdue. It's cost £4 billion of UK taxpayer bailout, and TfL have lost nearly £2 billion of unearned fare income that they would otherwise have accumulated.
Is that a fair point, Karen?
No, it's not a fair point, because the
Mayor hasn't effectively managed TfL's finances.
It's a jointly run project, as we all know. It's the problems that are in Crossrail, as with all massive infrastructure projects of this kind,
but did Sadiq Khan take his eye off the ball?
Yes.
Not at all. Not at all. Crossrail, we have to fully fund Crossrail. We have to get it delivered, and that is absolutely going to be essential for London's recovery. And what we know, and Gareth was saying that earlier funding was not as sound as it should have been. Well, compared to the previous mayor, we got London TfL into an operating, dealt with the operating deficit, built up the cash reserves, and yes, he did freeze fares, but that's because the previous mayor put them up by 42%. So you can look at all of these things from different angles. Providing the fare freeze and helping low-income travellers on London Transport was a good thing to do. London's transport finances were in a solid state before the pandemic, and it fell off a cliff.
Can I just ask you, before we move on to the next topic, the Mayor has suggested that if he doesn't get a share of vehicle excise duty, he wants £500 million a year, that he's prepared to introduce a boundary charge. Any driver coming into Greater London whose car's registered outside might have to pay between £3.50 and £5.50 for the privilege. Do you think that is serious, realistic? Is it going to happen?
It's an absolutely appalling suggestion. It's effectively taxation without representation. It would desperately harm the outer London areas within the Greater London boundary. My own constituency, which is right on the boundary, for example, business suppliers, 51% of Metropolitan Police officers live outside Greater London, 52% of firefighters live outside Greater London. Peter Fortune, who's the man who's campaigning to replace me on the London Assembly, has put a petition on his website. He's got over 11,500 signatures from local people wholly against this. The Mayor really shouldn't be playing games.
Sarah, what
like
do you
this.
think?
Well, I think that Sadiq Khan should be pressing for London to get the powers to introduce smart road pricing, which is a 21st century solution to tackling pollution as well as congestion and climate change. The 20th century solution of the congestion charges is quite aggressive as a flat rate system. So why is Sadiq Khan looking to the future? And this is something that my Lib Dem colleague, our mayoral candidate, Louisa Porritt, has pressed for. And London is obviously ought to be in the forefront of this.
Sarah, thanks for that. Karen, do you think this boundary charge is realistic?
I think it is realistic. I mean, obviously, as Sadiq's made completely clear, getting back the equivalent of the vehicle excise duty that London exports, £500 million, would be preferable, and that would be money that could be invested into London transport. But if we need to keep our transport system operating and meet the kind of post-COVID conditions, and we don't know what the volume of travelling is going to be, and we don't know what conditions people are going to expect on the public transport system, we need that investment. If we don't get it from the government, then it is going to be necessary to look at other ways. It's going to be a 2-year project, even to do the feasibility and the studies and the consultations.
You talked about post-COVID conditions there. Let's talk about those. We now know what the Prime Minister's roadmap to freedom looks like. As expected, the first to open will be our schools on March the 8th. Everything else will take time, with the promise that this should be irreversible. But that depends on the vaccine rollout and whether any new variants of the virus can be contained. It was the success of the vaccination programme and new research showing how effective the jabs are which gave the Prime Minister the confidence to publish his roadmap.
Every day that goes by, this programme of vaccination is creating a shield around the entire population, which means that we're now travelling on a one-way road to freedom.
From Monday, March the 8th, all children will be back at school. In secondary schools, pupils will have to wear masks in the classroom as well as in corridors. Labour thinks teachers and staff should be vaccinated.
Within weeks of schools returning last autumn, thousands of teachers and school staff were self-isolating, causing huge disruption to the running of schools and children's learning. We don't want that again.
Sitting formal exams is no longer on the school timetable after the Education Secretary announced today that teachers would decide pupils' grades.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that no algorithm will be used for this process. Grades will be awarded on the basis of teachers' judgment and will only ever be changed by human intervention.
Mr Williamson listened to the concerns of the chair of the Education Select Committee, who's worried about grade inflation.
Will my right honourable friend confirm what is the government's plan to ensure we will not have a wild west of grading, that these grades will be meaningful to employers so as not to damage children's life chances, and when and how will we reverse the grade inflation?
Unlocking lockdown will be done in 4 stages over 15 weeks. For some of London's economy, it's far too slow. June the 21st, the longest day, feels a long way off. And the plan isn't set in stone. If the vaccine programme trips up or a new variant of the virus rears its head, the road to freedom could be even longer. Sarah, I don't know if you've had a vaccine yet, but 1.8 million Londoners have. Credit where credit's due to the government?
I've had my first jab. Yes, obviously the vaccine rollout's been a great success, unlike, it has to be said, other aspects of the pandemic management in the last year. And the crucial thing about coming out of lockdown is that this must be final. We cannot possibly afford to go into a 4th lockdown. The stop-go has been extremely damaging, both to schools, to businesses, to family life, and so on. Yes, it's right that schools should be the first back, but we're not sure about 10 billion kids in one go. I think SAGE advised a phasing of it. We also think there should be things like rotas for spacing reasons. Yes, teachers and other school staff should be a high priority for vaccines. There should be money for laptops, for mental health support for children, and so on. But the key thing is that we cannot have a repetition of what has happened in the last year. So the government is right to be cautious now, but I just hope that Boris Johnson tackles his addiction to populist headlines.
Gareth, the infection rate is down to 84 per 100,000 in London. In Bromley, in your constituency, I think it's down as low as 54.
65.
65 now. But I mean, do you think the lockdown roadmap is fast enough?
I understand the argument of people that want to see it happening faster. I think we've all sort of got to the point now where we're just desperate to get back to normal life. And now that we can see the prize, we want to get it as quickly as we can. But I also understand why the government are now being cautious. I agree with the point that it would be damaging to go back into a cycle of lockdown, unlock, repeat, particularly damaging
What do you
for
say
businesses.
to your colleagues on the Tory backbenches who are pushing for it to go faster?
Well, I understand their point. I mean, people are making the points in varying different degrees of strength. I do understand where they're coming from, as I think the Prime Minister and the government do as well. I would rather, and speaking to local businesses in my local Chamber of Commerce, I would rather exchange certainty for pace at this point in time. I completely understand why people are at the end of their tether. They want to get out, they want to get it done. But actually, I would rather extend it for a few more weeks, which is what we're talking about, to get it out and get it done properly.
Karen, you must fear for some parts of London's economy.
I absolutely fear for London's economy. I mean, it's been catastrophic damage. And what I do think is that we really, and the government really mustn't cut corners in coming out of this. And that has meant, amongst other things, it's meant leaving those decisions very late to support the London businesses. We've got to wait till next week after the roadmap for the budget to know what the government's going to do about furlough, what the government's going to do about business rates, what the government's going to do about
You think that should
VAT.
be announced earlier?
I think the whole thing should have been rolled together so that businesses had as much opportunity to plan as they could have done.
Well, the support mechanisms that has been referred to, of course, run to the end of March anyway. So the budget is on the 3rd of March. So it gives them time to plan. And this is the point about not rushing the reopening as well. Businesses and everything else needs time to plan the reopening. One of the problems that we saw, I think, in last year, and it was done for the right intentions, but it ended up with the wrong result, is that we unlocked, and particularly hospitality businesses stocked up, and then because of the mutant strain coming out, we then had to lock up again, and all of that stuff ended up going in the bin. And that's why I think businesses would actually prefer certainty rather than pace.
So you don't want to see another eat out to help out?
Well, I wouldn't mind that if it was done in such a circumstance that we knew we weren't going to have to close down again.
Sarah, the pace of the lockdown, you mentioned caution earlier. Does it worry you?
Well, I mean, I think that we'd all love it. We'd all love to be free sooner. But as I say, I think certainty is better than speed, or speed for the wrong reasons. Business, is on its knees, and I'm particularly worried about the 3 million self-employed people who've been excluded, have had no financial support whatsoever, and there'll be a high proportion of those in London. Small businesses have had a really rough time, obviously in hospitality. High street shops, Louisa Porritt, my mayoral candidate colleague, sees an opportunity with more people home working to reinvent local high streets, perhaps with co-working places and cafes where people want to socialise. So we need to be imaginative about what we're able to do, because COVID has changed London, and there are some opportunities as well as obviously a great deal of damage that has been done, and we must seize those, and it must be a sustainable future for London as a livable city.
Sarah mentioned her mayoral candidate, Lib Dem mayoral candidate there. You're chair of Sadiq Khan's re-election committee. Yeah. Is the pandemic going to be an election issue?
Well, I think it will be, because I think there will be a scrutiny
of
the government's handling of it.
Sadiq Khan's handling of it.
Well, I think Sadiq has been championing the public health dimension for London, Transport for London, making the case for London, and also about policing London. So yes, I mean, I think I'm very happy that we will be standing on our record, including of the management and leadership of the city during a very, very difficult year. So that's a debate that I think we're all going to be too happy to have.
You're raising your eyebrows. Gareth, I'm not surprised, but...
Well, he went missing for a great part of the pandemic. He became the missing mayor, and nobody knew where Sadiq Khan was. I mean, it's a very difficult time for everybody, and I don't underplay
That's not entirely fair. I mean, he was told to stay at home like everyone else.
Well, yes, but then you didn't hear from him either. He just disappeared from the scene for quite an extended period of time. And as I say, I'm not downplaying the difficulty this has been for anybody. Everybody has faced something they've never had to face in their lifetimes. But as London's leader, he went missing, and I think people have spotted that.
One thing that happened today, you were at City Hall or online
Virtually.
taking part in the City Hall budget meeting. Sadiq Khan has put up his share of the council tax by 10%. That's going to play out in the election. Was
half of what the Tories said it was going to be put up.
But still, it's a fairly big hike when people don't need any bigger bills. Is he going to be able to defend that?
Well, he's going to be able to defend it on the grounds that if the government don't give you the money, as they haven't given local government across the board, that if people want, and they do, the policing and they want the investment in public transport, that has to come from the council tax. So it's £3 a week, and that's going to be shared between policing and transport. So it would be far better, given that Robert Jenrick, as the Community Secretary, says that the extra spending power with local government that they boast of actually includes the money that they have to raise by maximising their council tax, then it's a little bit of a contract. The government should be funding this so that we shouldn't have to rely on local government putting up council tax. But if they don't do that, then I think the London public wants to see a public transport system and policing properly funded.
Sarah, do you think the mayor had no choice but to put up council tax by this much?
10% is a bit of a whack, and I think the mayor does have opportunities to spend his money a bit more wisely. For a start, he could axe the expensive, environmentally damaging Silvertown road tunnel. He has a habit of spending a little bit too much on publicity and self-promotion, so he could probably tighten his belt there. And my colleague Caroline Pidgeon, who we heard from earlier in the clip, she has asked that if he's going to give himself a bit more money, how about a publicly accessible register of fire risk blocks, those with cladding and fire risk problems that potential owners and renters could access. And it's something that he has had the opportunity to do, and he could be making some alternative choices on spending.
Gareth, very briefly, we haven't got long left, but you wanted to come in there.
Yes, just briefly. I mean, there are choices open to the mayor. There have been every year of his mayoralty. He didn't have to put it up by this much. The GLA Conservatives today tabled a budget amendment that would have frozen council tax without putting a penny on it at all. He and the Labour group decided to reject that, as they do every year. The point is the mayor does have choices. He's just chosen not to follow them.
Thank you very much for talking to us. I'm afraid we haven't had time to talk about your experience with COVID, but you are much better now. You've got over it.
Much better, thank you, yes.
Karen, Gareth, Sarah, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's all from The Late Debate this week. I'll be back next month with another edition of The Late Debate. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.